Donald Trump's ideology and his campaign relies on the perception of a crisis or numerous crises. His message doesn't compel people if he weren't able to say it was responding to some sort of crisis. And that's why even as things have gotten a lot better since the disaster that was left by Donald Trump, he has to continue the rhetoric that Biden's destroying everything. And then the same thing with the border. Even as he's getting Republicans to obstruct solutions on the border, he has to speak about it like it's this crisis of all crises. And so that's why I want to focus on in this video, in this segment, the facts that are happening right now, and given the current news cycle, especially Biden-related news cycle, this stuff is not getting as much attention, that Trump really does not want you focusing on. Because if people understand in a more objective sense what's happening, it's hard to justify voting for someone who could be as destructive as Donald Trump. I obviously think it would be hard to justify, impossible even, voting for him regardless. But some people, and as we've seen throughout history, can do that math in their head if it's in response to an unprecedented crisis. Ben Wixler inspired this by posting, in case you missed it, amidst media and political drama, inflation falling, crime falling, border crossings falling, climate emissions falling, inequality falling, energy production growing, real wages growing, jobs growing, unions growing, stock market growing. And this was in response to someone reporting on U.S. inflation slowing again in June, in sign that price pressures continue to ease. The number of Americans filing for unemployment benefits falls last week and remains at healthy levels. And so we won't go through every one of those individual things that Ben Wixler mentioned, but I do want to talk about a lot of them because, again, what we're hearing from MAGA is this story about the current state of the United States that's not based on the factual reality, but is really provocative, sometimes fabricated stories, sometimes real but unrepresentative anecdotes are exploited in networks like Fox News to convince people and evoke emotions to convince people that they're living in a country that they're not, and that Trump has been telling people that we're in a quote-unquote third world nation, a nation in serious decline. If he doesn't win, it's going to be the end of America, he says. When in reality, what we're seeing is things continue to get better. And of course, as we go through these facts, I always feel the need to add the caveat. This is not about ignoring the very real issues that do still exist, but instead celebrating the progress that we're making so that we can understand which things are we doing correct so we can continue to do those things, improve on the areas we're doing wrong, to uplift people as much as possible. CNN does report on prices falling in June for the first time since the start of the pandemic. Americans weighed down by fast rising prices for 3 years just received more encouraging news on the inflation front. The Consumer Price Index, a measurement of the average change in prices for a commonly purchased basket of goods and services, dropped 0.1% from May. So an actual drop, not just a drop in the inflation, but an actual drop in the prices, which helped to slow the annual rate of inflation to 3% from 3.3% in May, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics' latest report. Falling gas prices as well as a drop in new and used car prices helped to usher in the first month-on-month decline since May 2020. And this is exciting. This is the easing of pressure that we want to see for people. And it comes as wages and wage growth continues to be strong. And that has led us to a place where Axios is reporting just 13% of workers in the United States are now earning less than $15 an hour. 2 years ago, that number was 31.9%. Even accounting for inflation, $15 an hour in 2024 has the same buying power as about $14 an hour in 2022. This is remarkable progress. So we want to continue raising those wages, but progress is being made. This also comes within the understanding that also from Axios, Former President Trump ran up the national debt by about twice as much as President Biden, according to a new analysis of their fiscal track records. Before going further, I find this to be an important segment to do as well, because there are a lot of people, based on the media energy that's being exuded, that are feeling hopeless and are feeling like maybe we're not going to be able to prevail. And I mean democracy. I mean continuing this sort of progress. The ability for us through our political system to make people's lives better could soon be hindered, and people are feeling the stress of that, and I'm there and I feel it. And also we need to remember that good things happening is possible. And if we can inform people on the progress we've made in the last few years since the economic, public health, and social crisis that was being mismanaged by Trump, then that can serve as a reminder of what could motivate us, not just negative motivation because of fear, but positive motivation because of excitement about furthering progress. Just a lickety-split pause to request you, if you're not already, to subscribe to the YouTube channel by clicking that subscribe button. So easy and free, but it makes all the difference in the world. Appreciate it. Back to the video. Then you have Stephen Ratner of MSNBC breaking down some Trump-Biden comparisons.
The worst economy in history. So let's look at a few metrics that might suggest the facts are actually something different. And you mentioned job growth. We can start with job growth. So this is job growth across presidents going back to Reagan, but let's focus for the moment on Trump versus Biden. And let's be fair and strip out the effects of COVID, which obviously hurt Donald Trump and ultimately helped Joe Biden during the recovery. So that's these darker bars. And you can see, even stripping out COVID, Donald Trump created an average of 182,000 jobs a month. Joe Biden created an average of 268,000 jobs a month. And that is not only more than Donald Trump, that is more than any president going back to somewhere before Reagan. We go back to Reagan here. So even Clinton, even Reagan, Joe Biden created, ex-COVID, more jobs. The president's been talking a lot about manufacturing jobs. So let's look at the record on manufacturing jobs. It is true manufacturing jobs began to come back under Trump. Not surprisingly, they fell off a cliff. And Joe Biden has brought them back to the highest level they've been at since during the financial crisis. We have 186,000 more manufacturing jobs than we had in 2008. Obviously, we'd like to have still more, but manufacturing is a very tough sector for us. And this is a pretty impressive performance.
So job growth.
Before they go further, I do want to note the way he worded that was a little strange with the Trump stuff. Not to pretend like not a single thing that was positive across any economic metrics happened to Trump. There were things that were positive, but I do want us to remember, if you extended that graph, you could bring up the split screen again, Jaden. If you extended the graph sort of backwards, you'd see that these are continuations of Obama-era trends, as we talked about before, but going further.
Growth better under Joe Biden objectively. Let's move over to your next chart, which is the growth of GDP and wages, how much money people are making. How do those two stack up there?
Sure. Well, GDP is obviously the holy grail of any economy. The faster you grow, the better off people will be. Sometimes with a bit of a lag, this and that, but they'll be better off. So again, let's be fair and let's strip out COVID from these results and take a look at what we see. So under Trump, GDP growth averaged 2.6% annual rate during his presidency, not including COVID, as I said. Joe Biden averaged 3.6% during his presidency. 1% on an economy that is well over $20 trillion is an enormous difference in terms of the amount of economic activity, extra economic activity.
And he goes further, but it's so fascinating. The best defense we've heard, or not the best, but the most common, and what I think comes off rhetorically is the strongest for people, of Trump and negative indictments of Biden for many. And again, when we're saying Biden, we're talking about the broader set of agenda items that were represented by him, but were his administration and Democrats in Congress and all sorts of different things going on there. But to simplify it, it'll be, yeah, well, Biden just benefited from a recovery that was going to happen anyway, so his numbers look artificially good, and Trump's look artificially bad because of the pandemic, and he didn't cause the pandemic, so we can't blame him for that. Now, before getting to my response to that that's the most substantive, it should be noted that they're hypocritical on that because they insist on blaming Biden and blaming Democrats for all of the bad conditions that really were inevitable from the pandemic or were being exacerbated by Trump and handed to Biden. And they blame those on Biden. For example, the massive amounts of spending and then the supply chain problems. And you add on top of that the corporate price gouging. But even just those two factors that led into Biden spiking inflation weren't a Biden phenomenon, but a pandemic phenomenon. And they blame that on Biden. Or crime, because of the conditions put into place by the pandemic and exacerbated by Trump's mishandling of them, spiked crime at the end of Trump's presidency, and then that went into Biden. They blamed crime on Biden, but then don't give him credit whenever crime plummets. And so there's that hypocrisy. They say, don't blame Trump. Don't blame Trump as a pandemic. But then they blame Biden for everything the second he comes into office. So that's dishonest. But you don't even need to go there to say, fine, remove the pandemic for both individuals. And the comparison still shows that we're seeing better economic gains being made under President Biden. Does that mean that every individual person right now feels better than they did before the pandemic? Probably not, given that the pandemic ruined a bunch of stuff. But what we need and what we're judging a president for is how they take the conditions they inherited and then make progress. And that progress arc is much more significant under Biden than it was under Trump, undeniably, even while understanding the very real concerns at this current moment, post-debate, regarding fitness and all the discussions that are going on around that. I'm not delegitimizing them, but instead trying to contextualize them. Bloomberg also reports, just sort of randomly, U.S. trade deficit with China narrows to lowest since 2010. The U.S. goods trade deficit with China shrank to the smallest total since 2010 last year, reflecting a decline in imports from its geostrategic rival that will be welcomed in Washington. So we're seeing that trade deficit narrow, which is a good sign in our competitive relationship with China. And by the way, also Fortune reporting U.S. economic growth will eclipse China's by 2031, and the transformation Beijing needs for a revival may take several decades, if not longer, top demographer says. So there, last year in 2023, we actually increased our lead on them in our economic size. And for a long time, we were still the dominant economy, the biggest economy. But China was growing faster. And so what this is projecting is that by 2023, we could start consistently growing faster than them and continue that gap widening in our already position of leading them. So some really good stories there, right? That's what Trump doesn't want people to know about, that things are actually getting better. Even just so interestingly, non-authorized crossings by people into the United States along the U.S.-Mexico border have dropped by more than 50% compared with record high crossings in 2023 or December of 2023. And it goes through the details. I do want to say, just to illustrate a point I've made for a very long time, of course, what we've seen from the right wing is, regardless of the facts, blame Biden. Blame Democrats if attempted illegal border crossings increase. But that means, in my mind, then sure, Biden administration, go ahead and take credit for a decrease. That's what they'll do. Alejandro Mayorkas is cited in this, talking about how the investments and some executive orders and some different actions they've been taking contributed to this. Maybe in part, it does seem like also a big part of it is, as the article notes, Mexican authorities cracking down on U.S.-bound migrants. And so as we say when they're trying to blame Biden administration, even if we're saying that this has to do with credit wanting to be taken, there's always a more complex conversation because this is such a complex issue and it's not as simple as, which is what Republicans want people to believe, just a lever the president is pulling up or down on, not so much. So again, two big reasons in talking about those facts today, and that's just surface level. We could go even deeper into a bunch of different areas, but it's number one, because there's been one story that everyone's focusing on, and it's an important one. When there are real public concerns about a president's competency, of course that's a story. And it seems he has at least considered dropping off the ticket. Now he's saying he's on the ticket. And so with that in mind, I think it's due time to compare records a little bit. Trump coming into office as Obama had overseen this recovery out of the Great Recession, and then our expectations, our economic predictions said things were going to continue chugging along at a nice pace. Trump took over, and by a few metrics, things slowed a little bit, but kept going. And then the pandemic crushed everything, okay? And then he mismanaged that. Total disaster. Refused to leave office until a bunch of allegedly illegal schemes failed. Divided the nation like we've rarely seen. Failed in his job as a leader and left a country in shambles. Biden takes over. We've seen on a bunch of different economic metrics recovery, and then also crime plummeting. Meanwhile, bunch of legislative achievements. So however you're feeling as a part of the Biden conversation, know that in the governing that we're seeing at this point in time, the United States has actually been making a lot of strides, and we should be proud and patriotic about that. And that's not a Biden thing by itself. There are a bunch of people that you could give credit to, including the American people, and their strength and their resilience. And so for us as Americans, don't let Trump convince you that we're living in a country that we're not. We talked about Colin Cowherd, funnily enough, a Fox Sports commentator, saying, Trump's always trying to convince me of an America that doesn't exist. And don't let Trump convince you that we're living in a crisis moment that we're not. There are crises, it's just not the ones that Trump wants you to perceive. And so whatever ends up happening with Biden's candidacy, that's something we should keep in mind as well. And hopefully we'll also see more balancing of the scale. The conversation got a little wonky. Seems still a little bit wonky. And the New York Times seems to be a little bit trying to make right on that here, saying Donald Trump is unfit to lead. And the editorial board has released, after releasing a Biden should drop out piece, they're responding to criticism, I think, and doing a Donald Trump should drop out, which is something we've been talking about a lot. If you're willing to make that claim about Biden, then I can only see you as honest and consistent if you first made that about Trump, that he should drop out, given convicted felon, given civilly liable rapist, given he tried to place himself above our Constitution after losing an election, etc. And that seems to be what the New York Times is at least calling for now. Let me know what you thought of that in the comments. If you want to get an extra episode of the show daily, you can do so by clicking the join button below. If you think sometimes that these types of segments don't come around often enough, right? Diving a little bit more into the meat of things, know that we do a lot of that on the bonus show, and it's a good time. So again, join button below is where you get access to that, and it supports the work that we do.